There's a moment that happens only once in someone's lifetime. A moment when the entire trajectory of who you are and who the world perceives you to be suddenly shifts. And on May 4th, 2026, that moment belonged to a 21-year-old athlete from the Philippines. But this story doesn't start with the glamour, it doesn't start with the cameras or the critics or the gasps of recognition. It starts in a much smaller place, a quiet moment in a New York apartment where a young woman stared at her phone, reading words that would reshape everything. The message came in the form of an arrival, not rushed, not frantic. A package wrapped in cream-colored material, sealed with intention, carrying an embossed symbol that required no introduction to anyone even casually acquainted with the fashion industry. Vogue, when fingers slipped beneath that seal and the contents revealed themselves. It wasn't a magazine cover offer, or a styling opportunity, or any of the typical collaborations that bridge the worlds of athletics and fashion. It was something infinitely more significant. It was a summons to the most selective evening in global culture. An invitation to the event where the line between who matters in entertainment, athletics, business, and art gets permanently drawn. And the name written on that invitation, Eala, created seismic waves that rippled across two entirely separate universes. In the tennis world, people understood her immediately. They'd watched her rise through rankings and Grand Slam tournaments. They'd celebrated her victories. They'd seen her face in frames that mattered, but to the fashion establishment, to the tastemakers and designers and editors who shape how the world dresses and presents itself, her name carried something different. It carried possibility. It carried cultural significance. It carried the weight of representation. Here's what most people misunderstand about the architecture of exclusivity in fashion. It doesn't operate on the economy of purchase. You cannot buy your way in. There is no credit card expansive enough, no donation generous enough, no publicist savvy enough to guarantee passage through those particular doors. This isn't a transaction, it's a selection. And the selector is Anna Wintour, the singular individual whose eye determines who ascends and who remains in the periphery. Twice yearly, more than 400 names get submitted for consideration. Designers, performers, athletes, entrepreneurs, influencers, the full spectrum of contemporary celebrity. Wintour takes that list and she begins the work of curation. She doesn't just nod approvals, she makes cuts. She understands that every seat represents a cultural statement. Every placement at a particular table sends a message about hierarchy, about arrival, about who's truly made it into the conversation that matters. No proxies are permitted unless she authorizes it. No exceptions to the ban on phones. The age minimum is non-negotiable. The seating arrangement is constructed with the precision of diplomatic negotiations. When Eala's name made that cut, when Wintour gazed at the roster and marked her approval, the tennis community experienced a collective jolt. Because by every measurable standard within her sport, Eala had already accomplished things that would ordinarily crown a career. She'd become the first player from her nation to reach the second round of a Grand Slam tournament during the professional era. She'd walked onto the most hallowed grass court in athletics, Wimbledon Center Arena, and dismantled the defending champion in a performance that had A-list entertainment figures rising to their feet. She'd reached a ranking of 28 globally, a placement that put her among the elite competitors on the circuit. The WTA had awarded her their Star of the Swing distinction, and the vote wasn't even close. 89% of public voters selected her, a margin so lopsided that dissent barely registered. Wintour herself had been courtside watching this young woman execute her craft at the highest level. But here's the secret that the tennis rankings and the trophy cases couldn't quite capture. This invitation wasn't about tennis credentials. It was a declaration. It was an acknowledgement that Eala had transcended her sport. She'd become something larger than athletic achievement. She'd transformed into a cultural phenomenon, someone whose presence in a room alters its entire energy. The invitation said that Wintour saw in her not just an athlete but an artist, a voice, a symbol of where contemporary culture was headed. It said that a young Filipino woman with a racket had earned a seat at the table where the world's most influential people gathered. This wasn't the first instance of the fashion world extending its attention to Eala. Months before the Met envelope arrived, she'd been cultivating relationships within the fashion architecture. Vogue Philippines had already wrapped her in recognition, featuring her on their cover as one of the earliest athletes to carry such prominence on their masthead. Nike had launched the Full Bloom collection in partnership with her, a line that wove elements of Philippine cultural heritage, specifically the national flower, into her on-court attire. Every piece told a narrative. Every collaboration reinforced a singular message. She was an athlete who carried her country's identity with pride, who refused to compartmentalize her heritage into the off hours of her life. On the court, in competitions, in the most high-stakes moments, she adorned herself with the symbols of where she came from. But here's the critical distinction. Magazine features and athletic sponsorships operate within defined territories. They're contained. They're professional relationships between aligned interests. The Met Gala occupies different terrain entirely. It's where art genuinely merges with celebrity. It's where the red carpet becomes historical documentation. Attendees don't simply pose. They make statements. Their presence, their choices, their visual language gets analyzed frame by the fashion architecture and cultural observers for months afterward. The event itself is held in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, beneath architectural grandeur, that reminds every participant that they're entering a space where aesthetics matter, not as commercial enterprise, but as human expression. Serena Williams had walked those steps before her, and fashion had granted her legitimate icon status. But this would be Eala's moment. Her turn to demonstrate that the boundaries between athletic excellence and cultural influence are far more permeable than tradition suggests. The 2026 edition carried particular weight beyond the ordinary Met Gala machinery. The theme, costume as art, established that evening as a moment where personal expression would be examined as seriously as any gallery installation. The museum was inaugurating an entirely new wing dedicated exclusively to fashion, a permanent architectural commitment that signaled the institution's recognition that clothing and style constituted legitimate artistic discourse. The co-chair lineup spoke volumes: Beyoncé, Nicole Kidman, Anna Wintour, and Venus Williams. That last name carries particular resonance. Williams had spent decades demolishing the false binary that suggested athletes could be either sports competitors or fashion figures, but not genuinely both. She'd proven that excellence in one arena could translate to creativity in another. Her presence as a co-chair meant she was literally holding the door open for the generation of athletes coming behind her, and Eala was the one walking through that door. When Eala began conceptualizing what she would wear to the evening's gathering, she made a choice that said everything about her character. She didn't contact prestigious ateliers in Paris. She didn't reach out to the constellation of luxury designers, whose names appear in Vogue's advertorial spreads. She didn't dispatch requests to the fashion capitals where celebrated couture houses maintain waiting lists measured in months. Instead, she called her uncle. Rhett Ayala, a Filipino designer with an established reputation within his country's fashion circles, had dressed beauty pageant contestants and political figures and prominent women across the archipelago, but he'd never been asked to create for the world's most prestigious fashion event on 7 days' notice. The assignment Eala gave him was simultaneously uncomplicated and audacious. She wanted something authentically Filipino. She wanted the dress constructed from pina, the centuries-old textile woven from pineapple leaf fibers, a fabric that carries significant cultural and historical weight within Philippine tradition. And with a casualness that reflected her personality. She added one more stipulation. She needed to be able to remove the upper portion of the ensemble, should the evening's progression lead her toward dancing. Ayala and his team didn't sleep. They prioritized every decision. The result that emerged from that compressed timeline was technically spectacular, but more importantly, culturally profound. The foundation consisted of a floor-length strapless gown in blush-tone chiffon. Soft, luminous, the kind of fabric that photographs beautifully under museum lighting. Layered atop this base was a detachable cropped bolero constructed entirely from pina fabric and featuring the signature silhouette that defines traditional Filipinana garments. Butterfly sleeves that extend outward with structured width, unmistakably Filipino, rooted in centuries of sartorial tradition. Ayala's innovation wasn't simply repetition of historical costume. He translated it. He took the DNA of his cultural heritage and reframed it for a 21st century stage. The design felt contemporary in its execution while remaining spiritually tied to its sources. It could stand beside any haute couture creation from Milan or Paris without apology, while simultaneously maintaining absolute authenticity to its origins. The detachable element wasn't mere practicality. It was metaphorical. It represented Eala's entire approach to her identity. She would wear her culture with full presence and intention throughout the formal proceedings, and later, When the formal evening shifted into celebration, she would maintain access to freedom, the freedom to move differently, to express herself without restraint, to dance. May 4th arrived with the weight of anticipation. A vehicle moved through Manhattan's streets, carrying a young athlete toward the museum that would serve as the backdrop for one of the year's most scrutinized moments. When she emerged from that car, the response wasn't measured. The cameras didn't simply function. They erupted. The crowd barriers held dozens of people who had positioned themselves to witness arrivals, and the collective sound they produced indicated that something significant was occurring. Fashion journalists, who had spent hours documenting name after name, suddenly snapped to attention. They recognized that the moment had shifted. She was ascending the iconic exterior staircase with an assurance that spoke to her comfort in high-pressure circumstances. This was someone who'd served at match points, who'd managed crowds and expectations and the weight of representing her country. The Met Gala steps represented a different arena, but the composure was identical. The WTA community experienced the moment simultaneously through their screens. Madison Keys, a title holder herself, one of the most articulate voices in professional tennis, absorbed the images and responded immediately. Her colleague looked nothing short of extraordinary. Jessica Pegula, ranked among the tour's elite, typed out what everyone was thinking. Though few possessed the clarity to articulate it so directly, she possessed the presence of a princess representing her entire nation. Zabe Sanmez, someone who'd spent considerable time with Eala on tour, who understood her not merely as a competitor, but as a person, responded with 3 letters that required no elaboration: the pure emotional reaction to witnessing something genuinely meaningful. Other voices piled in: Storm Hunter, Katie Bolter, Victoria Azarenka, an entire athletic community suddenly redirecting its attention toward New York, toward the museum steps, toward their colleague in her moment of cultural transcendence. The fashion criticism machinery generated its assessment with surprising unanimity. The phrase that kept appearing in professional analyses was some variation of the idea that a star had been born, not created through sponsorship or marketing manipulation, but revealed through genuine presence and intentional choice. Critics noted that what transpired on those steps suggested an athlete equally commanding off the court, equally aware of visual language, equally capable of shaping narrative. But these external validations, however significant, didn't capture the truth that Eala herself communicated when she addressed her followers. Her caption contained 2 sentences that encapsulated everything. The first acknowledged that few garments carry the emotional resonance for Filipinas that the Filipinana does. The second explained that she'd selected this particular outfit as a deliberate acknowledgement of her origins and as a visible representation of what she carries with her into exclusive rooms. That phrase, "what I carry with me when I step into rooms like these," is the absolute core of this narrative. This wasn't a strategic fashion choice designed to impress critics. This wasn't a calculated move to demonstrate off-court cultural relevance to the tennis world. This was something far more fundamental. Eala had spent her entire career making the same choice: to acknowledge and honor where she comes from. Every Grand Slam tournament, every center court appearance, every trophy ceremony, every professional collaboration had featured the consistent thread of cultural pride. She'd never attempted to minimize it or segregate it into her personal life while adopting a different identity professionally. The Met Gala simply represented the grandest possible stage for this already established commitment. Here's what transformed this moment from merely impressive into genuinely significant. Eala carried not just her own aspirations through those museum doors. She carried the hopes of a nation, 110 million people, according to population estimates, who'd waited decades for a moment when someone of their background would be recognized as belonging in the world's most exclusive cultural spaces. The Philippines has produced athletes and artists and business people of genuine global caliber. But rarely, if ever, has one of them been acknowledged by the fashion establishment at this particular level of prestige. Rarely has someone representing islands Southeast Asia received validation from the architectural elite of global culture in such unambiguous terms. The Met Gala's history includes several athletes who transcended their original sport through fashion and cultural presence. Serena Williams serves as the most obvious precedent, a tennis player who became a genuine fashion icon through her own innovative visual presentation. Venus Williams, as mentioned, spent decades expanding the definition of what an athlete could be beyond the parameters of competition. they created precedent. They proved that the journey from athletic excellence to cultural influence wasn't merely possible, it was natural, logical, even inevitable for certain individuals with the charisma and intelligence to navigate both worlds. But there remains something unprecedented about Eala's particular ascension. She was the first Filipino tennis player to ever reach that specific institutional level of recognition. She was the first person representing the Philippines to be selected by Wintour for the Met Gala with such prominence, and her decision to dress in contemporary yet authentic Filipino fashion, rather than adopting the standardized aesthetic vocabulary of global haute couture, represented a distinct cultural statement. She could have contracted a European atelier. The gatekeepers would have applauded. Instead, she chose representation over prestige, authenticity over aspiration toward European aesthetic dominance. When photographers captured her ascending those steps, the butterfly sleeves catching the artificial light, the pina fabric moving with intention, her expression composed and entirely present, they captured something that transcended fashion coverage. They captured an origin story. A girl who trained on a basketball court that had been physically painted over to function as a tennis practice space in Quezon City was now positioned at the absolute center of global cultural attention. A nation that had been historically positioned at the margins of the fashion world's consciousness was being represented with dignity and power. A young woman was translating the historical narrative of her people into visual language that the world's most influential cultural institutions recognized and validated. That image, that dress, that moment will reverberate far beyond the typical seasonal cycle of fashion coverage. Fashion historians will reference it when documenting the global diversification of runway and red carpet representation. Tennis analysts will note it as the definitive moment when athletic excellence translated into broader cultural authority. Philippines cultural advocates will point to it as an inflection point, the instance when their nation's artistic traditions were no longer novelties or alternative aesthetics, but legitimate components of global fashion discourse. The journey from a painted basketball court in a provincial Philippine city to the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dressed in one's country's traditional fabric, carrying one's culture as a statement of pride rather than as something to be minimized or compartmentalized, that journey represents precisely the kind of narrative inflection that defines eras. It suggests that the international cultural gatekeepers are beginning to operate differently. It indicates that belonging at the highest levels of exclusive spaces is no longer exclusively available to those who abandon their origins. Eala walked through those doors fully herself. She claimed her place not by becoming someone else, but by being fully, unapologetically, authentically who she'd always been. The flowers that decorated the museum that evening have long since faded. The photographers have returned their equipment to storage. The reviews have been archived, but the cultural significance of that night persists, because some moments don't simply occur and disappear. Some moments alter the trajectory of possibility for everyone who comes after. And for the millions watching from the Philippines, from throughout Asia, from every margin of the world where representation at elite institutions has historically been scarce, that night meant something that transcended the typical metrics of fashion success. It meant that excellence in one's chosen field, combined with cultural authenticity and refusal to apologize for one's origins, is not a limitation. It's an asset. It's the thing that transforms someone from merely successful to genuinely iconic.